Power and corruption, two sides of a wicked coin. Welcome, everyone, to our inaugural edition of Wicked Coin. Mom, I know you're listening. I am Tatiana Sinati, co-host, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Diana Shaw,
and by our story developer,
Fab Patria.
We are all attorneys here at Wiley Ryan, a DC-based law firm. I am the co-head of our International Arbitration and Disputes group here. My co-head of that practice, Josh Simmons, you may all know from his own podcast, Crypto Counsel.
Love the cross-sell.
Diana is a partner in our white collar group and also the former acting inspector general of the United States State Department. So she brings some really helpful insights into oversight, transparency, and accountability. And Vabe is an associate in our government contracts practice, which will be particularly interesting for this episode. Each month, we will be telling the story of one of the largest, most salacious corruption scandals, exploring the myriad ways corruption creeps into the hearts and minds of men and women, the consequences of corruption for perpetrators and victims, and the red flags that, had they been identified and addressed, might have changed the course of history. So, Diana, can you share with our audience why we decided to use the title Wicked Coin?
Sure. We actually had a lot of fun coming up with the name for the podcast, but the one that we landed on was Wicked Coin. It comes from a quote that I found in a book called Spectacle of Corruption by an author called David List. The quote is, "Power and corruption go hand in hand like two sides of a wicked coin." And it just felt fitting for a podcast about corruption and compliance. You and I are both fascinated by scandals and people behaving badly, and it just seemed like the perfect fit for what we wanted to talk about.
And why do you think it's so important to be telling these stories?
Well, I think what's particularly interesting about the podcast that we're creating is, a lot of these stories are out there. They're well-known scandals. But why I think it's important for us to be telling it is, one, I think we're good storytellers.
Very true.
I think we're going to tell it differently. But the other thing that I think we bring to the table is the compliance piece, right? Everybody knows what went wrong, but not a lot of time has been spent thinking about why they went wrong and what could have been done differently to keep it from happening. And I think that's where our expertise is really important and where we have something to add. So I think that's why it's incredibly important that we tell these stories and tell them from our lens.
I mean, obviously, I agree with that since I am the co-host, but I do think you have an interesting perspective as the former acting inspector general for the State Department. And can you tell our listeners what an inspector general is?
Sure. So in the federal government, most of the big departments and agencies have an independent oversight arm that are called the inspectors general. And they do audits, some inspections, evaluations, and investigations. And basically, they're there to ensure that taxpayer dollars get spent in the way they're supposed to. And they're supposed to identify corruption and make sure not only that there's no fraud and waste in programs, but also that programs are efficient and effective. So I've spent the last almost decade of my career looking at how we can make government better, but also helping to unravel some pretty gnarly corruption scandals myself. So I have a lot of real interest in this from a professional and a personal perspective.
And I think that's a fantastic lead into this week's episode, because we will be examining over the course of our sessions, hopefully many sessions, a number of different scandals, both in the public and private sectors. But this week, we're going to be launching our podcast with the story of the Fat Leonard scandal. Mm-hmm. And this looks into how a businessman from Malaysia bribed dozens of high-ranking military officers and defrauded the United States Navy of tens of millions, possibly billions of dollars, and put our nation's security at risk. So it's a story of booze, sex, and greed on a massive scale. But it's also a story of how power leads to corruption and corruption leads to power, and how things might have been different if there had been an independent inspector general.
Love it.
Yeah, I think you'll enjoy this. At the center of the story is one man, Leonard Francis. He was a 6'3" tall Malaysian who grappled with his weight. And I think that's actually an important point, because he would use the fact that he was obese and had all these weight struggles as one mechanism to create a false sense of intimacy with some of his targets within the Navy. So he would tell these elaborate stories of like his lap band surgery gone wrong in order to get people to think, wow, like we're really close. This guy is my friend. Look at these details he's sharing with me. And I think kind of speaks to his really high EQ and his ability to really target people who wanted a friend and become that friend.
Interesting.
He was born into a wealthy family that controlled a firm providing supplies and stevedores to cargo ships in Singapore. That was not enough for Leonard Francis. I'm not going to call him Fat Leonard because he never really liked that nickname. So out of respect, and you kind of have to respect his audacity, I'll just refer to him as either Leonard or Francis. But that was not enough for him. He always wanted more. And he had an obsession with American music, American TV, and the American military. And he decided that the way his family could get more is by becoming the go-to resource for the U.S. Navy in Southeast Asia. The ports in the Philippines were shutting down to the U.S. Navy. They were looking for alternative places, and what they needed were what's called husbandry services. So that's providing like tugboats and water taxis and taking waste and sewage away from these massive naval ships. And he was, one of the surprising things to me about this story is he was really good at providing these services. I don't think he would have had to bribe his way into getting these contracts and establishing a good relationship with the military, but he did it anyway because he wanted more. So he founded his company, Glen Marine Enterprise, in the 1990s, and he saw this immense potential in developing a lasting relationship with the military. And the core of his business plan was really personal service. So from his earliest days in the industry, he was really focused on making sure that when the U.S. ship came to port, he took out the highest ranking officers on that ship and showed them a really fantastic time. So it was everything from little things like providing them with a Jaguar as their car to transport them around town, to things like treating admirals and captains to these like tens of thousands of dollars in dinners at the fanciest restaurants in the world with the top shelf of booze. He would provide all of this for free to the naval officers. They were supposed to report any gift over $20. They never reported these.
Yeah, my little alarm bells are ticking like crazy right off the bat, but interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting. On a few occasions, he would send his invitations to admirals or the captains of the commanders, I believe they're called, of the ship. And they would pass them on to their embedded JAG officers and say, hey, is it okay if we go to these? And one
Those are the lawyers, yeah?
Yes, the lawyers. And in one Debbie Downers. And in one circumstance, the JAG officer was like, oh, I can tell the commander really wants to go to this.
Yeah.
So I'm going to tell him that if everyone's going, it's fine. Or another one was like, well, you need to pay for your own portion of the meal. And that sparked this trend of some of the officers paying like a token. Like, here's $100 for me, or here's $100 for each of the men, when it was actually like $800, $900 a person.
So basically, they're just clearing their consciences, but not really
exactly
addressing the issue.
Exactly. And good food was just the start. And I mean, that quite literally was the start. He'd start off by giving you a great meal. Then he'd provide luxury travel, complimentary stays in the, presidential suite at the finest hotels. He would provide those really nice car services. He would take admirals and captains' wives on shopping trips.
Interesting.
Yep.
Trying to think what the justification would be for that for any government employee.
Not sure.
Struggling.
Not sure. There's one great anecdote where he presented the wives of two admirals with luxury handbags. And one, I think, was like an Yves Saint Laurent bag. The other was a Gucci bag. And one of the wives returned it because she noticed some like problems with the zipper or something like that. And she was like, this is just not up to my standard.
Not up to par. Wow. I was about to say good for you, but I take it back.
No. No, she just wanted a better version of the same handbag, one that didn't have those little defects. So, which she received. Yes, wow. He did correct that mistake. When the wives were not around, he started bringing women to these parties, prostitutes. He would actually throw sex parties. Yes. And he developed an understanding of the type of women that different naval officers liked.
Oh my God.
Yes, to make sure that he had those women available for them. And this was like his most effective tool. And I think it's because of the bribery potential. He'd also take pictures at all of these parties and events, and he'd make sure to get pictures of himself with the admirals and commanders of these ships. And they knew, I mean, one officer even said, I knew that this was going to show up in a court of law someday.
It's interesting to see how he hooks them with small bait and then finally got them to a place where he knew then that they couldn't get out of it. They were backed into a corner.
Yeah. Well, and it really was like kind of test balloons, right? Like, who is going to be amenable?
It's quite a long game he was playing, right? I mean, this is cultivating people over years, presumably.
Yes. Wow. Yes. And he would identify, you're so right, because he would identify up-and-comers, and he would really start to go after these like young but really highly regarded officers. And he had a way of identifying them, and he was like, you're going places. So a lot of these officers wound up becoming admirals down the line, or becoming high-ranking commanders down the line. They weren't necessarily when he started his relationship with them, but they were by the conclusion. So he really was in this for the long run. He also would use his recruits within the Navy to get additional recruits within the Navy. So
it's like a pyramid scheme.
Yes. And he'd ask them, like, who do you think, when one was, for example, all of his interactions were really with the 7th Fleet, which is the fleet that patrols the Pacific Ocean. And if someone was going to be rotated on his payroll, was going to be rotated off of the 7th Fleet, he would say, well, who are we going to find to replace you? And they'd put their heads together and work to figure out who a good next target might be. He was extremely good at what he did. Like, I think we're lucky that he was not a Russian or a Chinese spy, to our knowledge.
So what was his end game?
Money. He really wanted money and power. And he would start once he had hooked his recruits, he would start asking for favors in return. And there too, it could start pretty small, like, well, I want you to turn a blind eye if I am overcharging for, a big one that he would overcharge for was the removal of sewage from these ships. And he would do it pretty brazenly, like charge for more sewage than the ship actually could contain. It's kind of obvious.
Yeah.
But he'd want them to turn a blind eye. And when someone more junior tried to report, for example, the officer actually reviewing the invoice was like, wait a minute, this is wrong. He had the senior officer in his pocket, and they'd just be like, shut up.
So when we're talking about him turning a blind eye, how much profit is he making on this? Because all these bribes are tens of thousands for each officer. How is he turning a profit?
Well, he was overcharging by millions of dollars for every port visit. So these ships would come to port, and they would dock, and he would have a contract for certain services, the water taxis, the sewage removal. He had this thing called the Ring of Steel, which was basically a bunch of, I don't know, I got the sense from reading about it that they're sort of defunct tugboats and cargo ships and stuff like that, but he would make a ring of them around visiting warships. And this was really a play on national security concerns. What he would tell the ship's officers is, this ring of steel is going to prevent terrorists on a ship from driving up with a motorboat filled with explosives and doing harm to your ship. That was never tested. There's no proof that it could have done that. It looks kind of hard to believe, apparently, from looking at it, that it actually would have been effective at it. But he, time and again, got them to pay outrageous amounts for this ring of steel. And Diana, you might know something about this. There's no line item for something like that. So there was no baseline price for what the military should be paying for it. So he kind of charged whatever he wanted.
Interesting.
And another piece of this was, after 9/11, the U.S. was paying a premium for security services, which makes a lot of sense. And he really capitalized on that by saying, well, do you really want to risk it with your ship? And these commanders are absolutely responsible for the safety of their men and their ship. And so oftentimes they would say, well, no, I guess it's worth it.
So how long did this go on?
Decades.
and nobody saw it coming. How did he get discovered?
Well, there were 27 investigations.
So what tipped the scales? What finally caused the whole scheme to unravel? Do we know?
Yes. Well, so first up, with these original 27 investigations, what he did is recruit someone within Naval Criminal Investigative Services, NCIS, of Mark Harmon fame. He had one of their stars who he identified, and I think he bragged about this to some of his other moles, was a lonely alcoholic sex addict. And what he really did is make this agent, John Bellevue was his name, but he made him believe that he was his friend and that he was going to be his buddy for life. He used his lap band surgery story as one of those ins to be like, look how close we are. And Agent Bellevue shut down a lot of those investigations, or just actually fed information about the investigations to Leonard so that he could shut them down. Yes.
Yeah, so that's definitely not allowed.
No.
Just in case anybody was wondering, that's not how it's supposed to work.
Definitely not. I mentioned at the outset, I think that there were some national security implications to this, which is ironic because one of the reasons he was able to get away with so much is that, again, after 9/11, the U.S. really diverted a lot of their investigative resources away from financial crimes and towards counterterrorism issues. And Leonard knew that. He knew that there wasn't as much of a focus on financial crimes and he could get away with more of this. I believe it went from 140 or so agents to 8 agents, none of whom were in Asia, beginning in about 2002. So there weren't a lot of resources. But what he would do is get military officers in the 7th Fleet to give him classified information about where ships were going to be docking in, like, over the course of a year. That's sensitive, classified information that we don't want our enemies to have. He wanted it so that he could position his operations more effectively to be like the most attractive offer. Well, I'm already there. I've already got the resources there. I can be a lot cheaper.
It's a huge competitive advantage.
Yep.
But they don't think he was using it to sell to adversaries?
He says he never sold it to adversaries, but he also said, but I don't know if they tapped into my system and got it. It was on his, and
plausible deniability.
His head of IT actually was really close friends with like a Chinese security attaché. And yes. So
Here we go.
Who knows? But the question that you asked of how did this get discovered? Well, one of his moles was a commander who he lured in with his typical sex and alcohol and fancy travel. That didn't have a great impact on this commander's personal life. He ran into a lot of issues with his wife, and his wife just started to notice some anomalies in his behavior and said, I think something is really wrong. She identified that something was really wrong in connection with his relationship with Leonard Francis, and she reported it to an NCIS agent. It was a female NCIS agent who was able to use her to try and start collecting more of this information.
Oh, wow. So is he behind bars now?
Well, no. So I will say, and I want to make sure I get these numbers right, when he was finally caught, there were 91 admirals who were investigated for taking gifts or having connections to him. The Department of Justice prosecuted 34 defendants in federal court, and 685 cases were referred to the military disciplinary authorities.
Wow.
That is how wide-ranging this was. The Navy adjudicated most of those cases in the dark. There had to be a number of FOIA requests put out to try and piece together what happened with those investigations. As for Leonard Francis, he was sort of in custody. He was able to talk his way, kind of charm his way into house arrest. And he had a very luxurious house arrest set up for himself. He was in like a penthouse suite.
Oh my God.
Had his own personal security. And he escaped. He was in San Diego. So it's, for anyone who knows San Diego, it's really close to the Mexican border. He got an Uber.
No, stop.
He got an Uber. He took it to the Mexican border. He crossed over. He flew to Cuba and then on to Venezuela. He was caught in Venezuela. and held in prison there for a while until a prisoner exchange was negotiated and came back to the United States. But the case has unraveled in large part because of prosecutorial misconduct. Prosecutors admitted to not turning over some potentially exculpatory evidence. And that led the judge in the case to, I think she sounded pretty appalled that she had to do it, but to vacate a lot of the convictions and even to vacate some of the plea deals with some of the defendants who had pleaded guilty to what they had done.
Is any of it going to be retried? Do we know?
As of right now, we don't know. As of December 2023, the Department of Justice was looking into what they were going to do, whether they could do anything further. I will say this, not a single high-ranking officer, not a single admiral. Remember, there were 91 investigated. One went to jail, but the remaining 90, some of them were asked to retire, but they all kept their benefits. I believe that the saying is different spanks for different ranks. So they all kept their benefits. No one was dishonorably discharged. The Navy really tried to keep this as hush as they could.
Right. It looks bad on them, too.
Yeah.
This is a lot of the problem when corruption embeds within a system, right? The people who should be incentivized to root it out and remedy it, because it has happened under their watch, have the perverse incentive to kind of sweep it under the rug or minimize it.
Yes.
And so that's to your earlier point, where an independent OIG, Office of Inspector General, can be really helpful because they are objective and independent and don't have the same incentives. And so can really drive some transformative change that otherwise institutions are reluctant to undertake on their own. This is a good segue to a recurring piece of what we plan to have as part of our podcast. We're calling it the Red Flag Roundup, where we come back through at the end of our storytelling and talk a little bit about some of the red flags that we see in the scandal and what might have been done differently. And I think we've just touched on a couple. One is transparency. I think it's so important to have transparency. And I think we see this throughout the process, but most recently, something you said made me think of it. When disciplinary process works in the shadows and people don't know what's happened, there's no transparency around accountability, you lose the benefit of a potential deterrent effect. And so I think where you can have as transparent a process as possible while still, of course, respecting people's privacy rights, the better. I also think something we have here, and I want to hear your perspective on this, is just like tone at the top. This whole thing just seems completely off because the tone at the top was where this started, right? We had the highest level officials completely bought in on this misbehavior, and it must have permeated all the way down the ranks.
It absolutely did. And one of the things that's really striking, I think, is he tapped into this sense of entitlement that a lot of these officers, and particularly the highest ranking officers, had. A lot of this was occurring when the U.S. was actively engaged in various conflicts around the world. You've got these officers who are stationed overseas and frequently on ships where life is pretty hard. They're deprived of a lot of not just luxuries, but like basic amenities. And they get into ports and there's this sort of expectation that, well, I deserve a nice meal. I deserve a nice car. I deserve to stay at a nice hotel. And you and I talked a little bit about this before, Diana, where I'm not entirely opposed to our military officers who are sacrificing and giving away a lot, being able to live it up a little bit when they go into port. Not saying I think they should have prostitutes.
Thank you for that clarification.
I had a nice meal.
Having been a government employee, it's not a luxurious life when you are on the road as a government employee. And there are good reasons for that. We want to be very judicious with taxpayer dollars. But I get what you're saying. Like, there are sacrifices that people make to do public service. And so it does create the risk that folks will be tempted away by some of these luxuries because they're not getting it on the other side.
Yeah. And I don't know the solution for that exactly, but I think to your point, there was this tone at the top that the most senior officers felt comfortable accepting these gifts. And as I mentioned, Leonard would take pictures with them. So he would make sure that other officers and lower ranking officers would see these pictures and be like, well, see, the admirals are doing it.
Right.
Why shouldn't you?
I think the takeaway here is for people in leadership to keep in mind that everybody is watching. You are setting the example, not just with what you say, but with what you do. And it is so important if you're trying to create a culture of anti-corruption, a culture of ethical behavior, that you live that promise every day in your actions, and that you really do set that tone from the top. And then on the transparency point, I think making sure that your internal processes are as transparent as possible and having strong oversight that is transparent. OIGs issue reports that are public. I think that's really important.
Yeah.
They call oversight the disinfecting light of oversight.
Yeah.
There's something to be said for the scrutiny that comes with public recognition of wrongdoing. And I think that's really important. Relatedly, you really have to think about reporting structures. I think in the military, when, chain of command is so important, the idea that, lower level, lower ranked folks are going to be able to escalate issues. I mean, you gave the example, right? They flagged the invoice that was obviously problematic and were told you're going to pass it through. It takes a lot of gumption to then go over your superior's head. It can be viewed as insubordination. And so that puts someone at real risk, personally and professionally. And so it's so important to have reporting mechanisms available outside of chain of command, whether that's a hotline, some kind of anonymous way to file complaints and reports. And then, beyond just having the mechanism in place, you need to have the back-end infrastructure and resources to make sure that those complaints are properly reviewed, taken seriously, acted upon. And that's then where the opportunity for real accountability comes in. But without those reporting mechanisms or the belief of those who are in a position to see this stuff, that if they report, it will be taken seriously and they will be protected and not retaliated against, this kind of stuff is always going to, continue, because the expectation that someone in that situation is going to always be willing to take on that risk is just, I think, very unrealistic.
Well, to wrap up our discussion, I think it might make sense to return to that point of how might the world have been different? How might things have turned out differently if, Diana, these red flags that you just identified for us had been seen and addressed earlier on in this story?
Well, I think there's no question that Mr. Leonard's reign would have been quite a bit shorter if some of these things had been addressed. Certainly if the right tone at the top had been set, it would have been much harder for him to have made the inroads that he did, and then to have been able to build out an empire that lasted as long as it did.
I would add one of the ways in which the worlds might have been different on the transparency point, and especially that point of justice being conducted in the dark with those internal naval investigations. Yes, it might have been painful and exposed the Navy to some external criticism and reputational damage that they didn't want. On the other hand, the scandal's out there. I mean, some of these prosecutions were public. The reputational harm was largely done. And I think an open process could have both salvaged that reputation, really shown a commitment to righting these wrongs and fixing things moving forward, and also been a really tremendous example globally.
I totally agree. I think the best way that you can rehabilitate a damaged reputation is to be accountable, right? That's how you rebuild credit. You own the mistake and you demonstrate what you plan to do to fix it. I honestly think that's the only way you can do it. And so I think it was a real missed opportunity on the part of the Navy.
Much more could be said about Leonard Francis. Indeed, entire books have been written, and I highly encourage anyone in our audience who wants to learn more to check out the information that we will be providing in our notes so that you can get all of the salacious details that you want to read. In the meantime, I hope everyone will tune in for our next episode next month, where Diana is going to be telling us yet another salacious scandal. Any teaser, Diana?
I'm going to make you wait for the details, but I will share that this is one of the world's largest sports scandals of all time, and it is a doozy. You're going to love it.
I can't wait. All right. So until next time, everyone, we hope to see you next month.
Until then,
Bye, guys.
bye.
Bye.